Hi, everyone. I think we're going to get started now. Welcome. We're going to talk about how practitioners use academic research today. This conversation comes out of my participation in this, solving global poverty conversations over the last year. And as I think Michael Olcott identified yesterday, there's sort of a gap in the theory of change of academics in general about how policymakers or decision makers make decisions and how they use evidence to make those decisions. And, when I hear things like, well, we'll put out an edited volume, and I cringe. I'm like, okay, that's great if you just want to talk to other academics. No decision maker in the US government, at least, is going to read an edited volume unless they're like pursuing a master's degree and they have to, right? So today's conversation is going to be about to try and give you some insight into the way that people who do use academic research but work in the US government or the World Bank, or for, as in my case, for an implementing organization, an INGO, how do we actually find, use the work that you do, and then what do we do with it? And what are the obstacles that we see to making the change happen that you would like to see happen based on the research that you do? So that's the goal of this panel today. And following this at lunchtime, I think each of us is going to sit at a different table, and we are very happy to chat with you further about your ideas about how to reach decision makers and any additional questions that you have that are not answered in the session. So let's do some introductions first. I'll sit down in a moment. My name's Laura Adams. I was an academic sociologist for about 17 years, have a UC Berkeley PhD, and eventually decided that I wanted to do something that was more collaborative and maybe made a difference. I don't know if that happened when I made my career change or not, but I certainly work much more collaboratively with a wide range of people now. So my current job is at PACT, P-A-C-T, which is an INGO that works in the development sphere. And I work on a USAID-funded program that supports independent media and civil society around the world. We work in 15 different countries right now, I think. And before that, I had worked for another implementing organization, Freedom House, who many of you have heard of and quote on your slides. And then before that, I was actually in the office that Daniel's in now at USAID in the Democracy, Human Rights, and Governance, which is now a bureau at USAID. It's been elevated, yay. And I was on a team there that was called the Learning Team, a nickname for it. You can say what the official name is now. But that was a group of people, and several of us did have PhDs. There were actually a few recent political science PhDs and anthropologists who were trying to synthesize both research findings and bring new methodological ideas to the practice of incorporating research into USAID development programs, and also to evaluating those programs. So that's my brief resume. I'll hand it over to Daniel.
All right. Thanks. Good morning. Still morning? Yeah, good morning. My name is Daniel Savet. It's great to be with you all. So thanks so much for the invitation. And as Laura mentioned, I work at USAID in the Bureau for Democracy, Human Rights, and Governance. I also came out of academia. I was academic for about 6 years. And then I started dabbling in evaluation work, evaluating aid programming, ended up leaving academia and did that for about 7 years. Got super frustrated that even on the inside, so to speak, kind of generating evidence for USAID, that it wasn't really being used to the extent that I felt that it could. So now I'm on the inside. So now I work on that. We call it the evidence and learning team now. We've added an E. So the email team, machine learning team. And our main job is to, encourage, promote the use of evidence, and specifically research evidence in our decision-making, particularly in program design, and then to generate evidence to rigorously evaluate our program. So,
My name is Audrey Sachs. I'm a senior social development specialist in the World Bank's West and Central Africa region. I received my PhD in sociology from the University of Washington and joined the World Bank right after graduation. And since I've joined, I've been based in the Indonesia country office, the Central Asia region, and now the Africa region. And in my current position, I co-manage the World Bank's Nigeria for Women program scale-up project, which is a $500 million IDA investment, and the Liberia Women Empowerment Project, which is a $44.7 million investment. And both programs aim to empower women both economically and socially, and Liberia has a big emphasis on reducing gender-based violence. And I also try to keep up an active research agenda in my weekends and time and Fridays. And just to note that I'm here not in my official capacity as a World Bank official, but I'm here as a sociologist, exactly, who also publishes mostly in political science journals. Thank you.
I'll use the same disclaimer too. On behalf of myself, nothing.
Disclaimers, okay. Raise your hand if you want us to pull the microphones closer, or can you hear us okay? A little closer, okay, great. I thought it's hard to get the feedback, and it didn't sound very loud. So the format of this panel is basically sort of talk show style. I don't know what they said. Well, I've shared some questions that I'm going to pose to our panelists, and I will also add to them when it's relevant from my own experience. So we have several different questions that I think will cover the main topics that I would like you to hear about. And then we can turn it over to you to hear more about the topics that you would like you to hear about. Okay, so the first question is to kind of to give some context of how we got here and what we do. Can you talk a little bit about what you do in your day-to-day work and how your social science training relates to those tasks, if it does? And we'll let's start with that.
Okay, great. So my day-to-day job, I spend a lot of time following up with the government clients on making sure that the projects disperse because we are a bank and money has to go out. Money in the bank account is money not reaching our beneficiaries. So day-to-day, I wake up, I send about 3 WhatsApp messages to the procurement specialists for the project and make sure that contracting continues. The more interesting part of my work is around project evaluations. I care deeply about knowing whether or not the projects work as intended and as promised, both to the government and to clients. Just as examples, when I was in Indonesia, I worked with Jay Powell and Ben Olkin from MIT on a 10-year-long evaluation of a community-based health and education program. And what we found through this randomized control trial was that after 10 years, it wasn't the case that the program didn't work, but the control areas caught up with the treatment areas in terms of stenting reduction. But the program continued to have impact on bringing women to health clinics and getting immunizations and coming in for prenatal and postnatal treatments, even with a small block grant. For the Nigeria for Women project, we're collaborating with the American Institute for Research, and Thomas DeHoop is the lead PI. And for this, we have an impact evaluation. And what we found was after 2.5 years, the project has had pretty significant effects on women's savings, credit, income, diversifying opportunities. We've seen a shift in men's social norms. Specifically to women and also around gender-based violence. And we're seeing a very modest decline in gender-based violence prevalence, and it's going in the right direction. And based on these effects, the government chose to scale up the program from 6 states to 26 states. So like evidence matters a lot. And in Liberia, it's the same case. We're building a randomized control trial into the project. We're at the very beginning stages, but for me, like, this is really important because I want to know and make sure that the project doesn't have any unintended effects, because we're dealing with a very complex environment. I also spend a lot of time conducting observational analyses to try to inform the World Bank's global agendas and also on specific government policies. Just a few examples. A few years ago, I worked with Austin Wright at Chicago and Guy Grossman at Penn on a global study on human trafficking with IOM. And this was the World Bank's first global report on human trafficking. And what we found was that with global commodity price shocks, we saw increases in human trafficking. And this matters, right? Because we have investments in a lot of contexts that are very vulnerable to commodity price shocks. And over the last few years, I also worked with a whole group of academics where we commissioned 26 papers on forced displacement and social cohesion from around the world. And the core message of this report and the 26 papers was that refugees and IDPs bring a lot of positive benefits to the host communities. And we don't see, it was in very few cases where we saw any negative impacts. So this kind of empirical finding helps to play a role in our advocacy for more money going to forced displacement contexts. I'll conclude there.
Interesting. So my work is a little less project and topical focused. I'm in the democracy, human rights, and governance, so we touch all things democracy, human rights, and governance, which is everything from public financial management to human rights violations. Right? So it's a wide stretch of programming and you know, supporting our missions really throughout the globe. So not necessarily either. But I always describe my work as trying to promote the use of evidence and research evidence in our programming. So a lot of that is trying to take that research evidence that is out there and distill it, put it in formats and make it more accessible to our both our USAID cadre as well as our implementing partners. And so that's kind of a huge, and there's a lot more we could talk about in the details there. And then on the other side is, actually, we manage a couple of research contracts. And so we do a lot of evaluation work, a lot of assessment work, which is what we call just kind of research ahead of program design, as well as just kind of general research on certain topics. So for example, like right now, USAID is interested in transnational corruption. So we have a few studies on kind of how transnational corruption and this concept of strategic corruption manifests itself globally. So, and then of course, randomized controlled trials, like Audrey mentioned, we do not as much as we used to, but we still do have a few of those that we work on. But also trying to promote some other evaluation methodologies. We tend to do, USAID does an enormous amount of, at one point in time, send a team of researchers around to talk to people for 3 weeks and ask them questions about, you know, what they think is working and what are lessons learned. And there's certain value in those kinds of studies, and there's certain things that they're good for. But we tend to want to know questions like, did it have an impact? And then we're just asking people, you know, what do you think? Did it have an impact? Which is not a really great research methodology. So, trying to, we do still do a lot of that kind of, we call them performance evaluations, a lot of that kind of work, but trying to improve the rigor and how those things are working. So I'll stop there. There's much more detail to go into.
So I think the way that my training as a sociologist shows up most in my work is in being able to imagine the methodological possibilities for a particular concrete program and what kinds of questions are worth asking that would both help that program and other programs in similar contexts or similar programs in different parts of the world. So there's like a translational kind of piece to this of trying to figure out what's the appropriate methodology to answer this question that would be helpful in this context, and also generate information that could help inform the sort of like the hypotheses or things And so, yeah, so I think the methodological training for me has been my biggest asset that I've brought to this work, and why I've gotten the jobs I've gotten is because I've been able to do that. But also there's translating academic research into things that practitioners can find useful. I'll just give you an example of like what my day is like on this coming Monday. Like what does this look like? On Monday morning, I have to get up at about 5 a.m. Because at 6 a.m. East Coast time, we're having a research workshop in Bamako, Mali, where a research team made up of both Malian and international researchers are getting together to work with the teams that are implementing a sort of healthy information ecosystem program in Mali that's promoting the ability of citizens to be able to have better media literacy and be able to understand the sources of mis and disinformation and how to check on whether something's true or not and so on. And this is being done in rural areas, mostly rural areas, a couple of target regions. It's sort of a pilot project where information is transmitted orally. So it inherently has to be an ethnographic study. And I was on this project from the very beginning, just making sure we got an ethnographic study in here and we're not like analyzing metadata from Facebook. So this workshop is going to happen tomorrow morning, where the research team is going to present a design and hear back from us about the realities of whether this will work or not, or what kinds of activities we're actually doing. This is a USAID-funded project that's being implemented by my organization in Mali. But we're working with a couple of Mali-based or African-based organizations as the lead implementers of this project. And then they in turn have the cohorts of people in the localities that they're working with, that the next stage will be to go and sort of vet the research design with the people in the communities before we implement it. So that is, I would say, like the most like sociology thing I've been able to do in my 7 years after academia is get this project going. A more translational thing in the afternoon I'm doing is I'm meeting with another USAID-funded program that's working. It's the first USAID program to work with social movements. This is something that big funders have trouble funding social movements because they're not, organizations with financial policies and practices. Anyway, USAID's taking a nice, big leap with this after having many years of me and others in the agency trying to convince them that social movements are how change actually happens and that you should be working with social movements. So I know that issue resonates with a lot of you. Another really like super sociological thing that I've been doing in my career so far. But we're going to be talking about ways to take the research on networks, on social networks, on consortiums and collaboration, and the importance, I've heard this a couple times so far, the importance of having sort of a diversified network to achieve advocacy outcomes and so on. What is all the evidence? So I've been working this summer on summarizing the evidence on, on movements and networks and outcomes for an audience of practitioners, so that we can, and the document I'm working on is just specifically saying, if this is the kind of outcome you're trying to achieve, and you need to, have a diverse coalition involved, here are the things to watch out for. Here are the things you should build into your programming. So it's at that level of like very specific things you need to think about. And then like, how do we then design network analysis tools that are simple enough for a local civil society organization to use themselves and to interpret themselves. So those are some of the challenges around, so a particular topic and how I'm using my sociological background and training in this sort of nitty-gritty work. Okay, so the next question. So it's sort of the question about how do you find what you're looking for? How do you find and identify academic research? How do you consume academic research in your work? And what sources or databases do you use to find what's relevant to whatever task you have to work on? Daniel, do you want to start?
Sure, yeah, I mean, this in some ways is our job to make it easier for others to do this, right? So, and actually we commit a substantial amount of time and effort to that specific task. So for example, we generated for the democracy, human rights, and governance space, 6 evidence maps of all the experimental evidence, as well as some other qualitative research that can make some causal claims. Basically, it's if you've seen these evidence maps, right? So it's a bunch of interventions here in the rows and a bunch of outcomes in the columns, and then there's little dots, and the size of the dot is, you know, the amount of evidence linking this intervention to this outcome, and then you kind of click on it, and here's the 10 studies that speak to this. And so that's like one of the investments that we've made. A lot of it is making data more available, so not necessarily the analysis per se, but we have, for example, a database you can go in, has 400 DRG indicators, and you can, generate your indicators for the countries that you want and see what that data looks like. We have a similar thing that does it with survey repository. It takes all the barometers, the Latino barometer, the America's barometer, the Africa barometer, the Asian barometer, and it kind of pulls all that data into one place, so you can kind of, look at how that data looks. It's a little thing, but people actually love it. We call it Facty Fridays, and every Friday, my colleague Chris runs this. He sends out he just summarizes 2 academic studies that have come out. Well, not necessarily recently. Usually one is recent, and one might be kind of an older, more foundational piece. And it's just it's like this long, 2 little paragraphs, and with links to the article. And actually, we get a really high. People pay attention to it. It's like one of the most popular products because it's so short. It's just like it's Friday. Here's your 2 academic articles you can take a look at. So those are some of the things that we do. We're right now pulling together. So we have this evidence map of all the individual studies, but we're pulling together kind of a library of all the efforts to summarize the evidence on particular programmatic approaches, right? So some we've done ourselves. And that's another piece. We have it's called an evidence help desk. So if you're in the Philippines, for example, working in a mission there, and you want to get some research evidence in your program, and you can reach out to our help desk, and we'll basically match them with an academic who will write up a review using kind of a template that we have that's trying to make things kind of more digestible and easier and simpler to follow and understand. And then beyond writing it up, it's a conversation, right? So conversation with that academic about that topic, and a chance for them to ask questions. And kind of, we're not very good at reading. We don't have time for that. So it doesn't getting people to read stuff can be very challenging. But you can put a meeting on someone's calendar, and they will show up. They won't read for 5 minutes, but they'll sit in a meeting for an hour. This is kind of how government works, right? So that kind of face-to-face interactions is super important for us too, besides just kind of generating more content for them to read. It's shorter content, it's more digestible content, but it's still stuff that people have a hard time finding, accessing, and really taking the time to think through. But a conversation can be much more fruitful. So those are a few thoughts.
Great. I read. And I'm proud of that.
That's good. Congrats.
Okay, so right now I'm reading all about women's village savings and loan associations across Africa, because the Nigeria for Women program is putting in a lot of money into organizing women's self-help groups based on the example of the National Rural Livelihoods Mission in India. And one of the questions I had just going into the practical day-to-day work and helping the government with the operational manuals is that, why is it the case that groups are setting interest rates at 10%? Why is it the case that repayment periods are after 3 months? And what we found is that there isn't a lot of literature on this topic. So what we're doing now is we're randomizing these governance rules across a subsection of the women's, we call them women affinity groups in the Nigeria for Women program, and we're going to try to figure out what works better for women's ability to borrow and save and grow their businesses. Another, just an example, again, of how I use evidence and reading is supporting the government of Sierra Leone with scaling up a framework called the One Family framework. It means one family. which originated with Family Talk. It's a small grassroots NGO in Sierra Leone. And we're doing a qualitative assessment of Family Talk's programs right now. And what we found was that community members are talking a lot about this bonfire that this NGO has organized in communities for the last 15 years since the Civil War ended. And the bonfires bring together women and other community members to talk about really challenging issues. And it stimulates tough discussions, but they appreciate it because it helps to solve community problems. And throughout the qualitative assessment, community members are all over the place are talking about this bonfire. Sure enough, after we're halfway through the qualitative assessment, we found that there was an article published in Science that did a randomized control trial of this bonfire intervention and found that the bonfires improved reconciliation and social capital, but came at the cost of community members' personal well-being because of the re-traumatization effects. So now this is taking me a path down to a question of how do we support governments and communities with psychological interventions when in a lot of the countries there are only 4 or 5 psychologists for the whole country. And in America and other countries, we think of psychological interventions based on a one-to-one interaction. But I'm now doing research to see, okay, what models exist for psychological interventions that are designed more at the community level. So I'm just starting down this path, and hopefully we'll find some interesting interventions that have shown to be effective that we can also support governments with operationalizing. Over and thanks.
But how do you find the things you read? Do you use JSTOR? I mean, is what you do different from what the people in this room would do?
Good question. I like scanning the indices for the American Political Science Review, American Journal of Political Science, World Development, and the like. So I try to do that on a monthly basis. And then I also depend on my academic collaborators to also send me articles that they know I'd be interested in. And I try to attend seminars at the World Bank where academics present their newest and latest research.
Same for you, Daniel. You mentioned sort of the help desk, right? And that sort of dovetails with something we were talking about yesterday for this Institute on Global Poverty. At Johns Hopkins, somebody mentioned the idea of having a sort of, like I was thinking of it as like a library you can check out as sociologists. So how do you find the academics to support your help desk requests?
Yeah, it's so I mentioned at the top we have kind of 2 research contracts. So one of those contractors is a group called the Cloudverse Group. Great group of people, and so we just channel things to them, and they find the people for us. But it's generally a search of we are usually looking for academics with country level expertise, right? So that it's fairly easy to kind of narrow those searches down and identify those individuals. But yeah, so it's mainly relying on those individuals, and we're very Google Scholar dependent in general. A few of my colleagues use Elicit and are more kind of trying to do some of the AI stuff. I'm not quite there yet, but
yeah, this links up to the second set of questions we have, which a lot of the conversations we've been having around the solving global poverty idea are about the dominance of a particular discipline in the development world, that is economics. I thought it's interesting, like Audrey, you listed mainly like political science journals. I know that historically the Democracy, Rights and Governance Center kind of has a bias towards political science because democracy is political. So anyway, I'm wondering in terms of how do you see sociologists, plugging into this, given what a lot of the people in this room would like to do is sort of, get over that obstacle of the disciplinary biases of development practitioners. So thoughts on that?
I can, yeah. I mean, it's an interesting question because for us, I mean, yes, we probably do pull more political scientists than any other group, although I can certainly think of several sociologists and anthropologists and economists that have worked with us. You know, a lot of this is both a kind of, in some ways a strength, but in other ways a weakness. We're pretty atheoretical, right? I mean, we don't really want people coming with a theoretical framework that's going to guide the research. I mean, we have simple questions that are not derived from theory, but are derived from the decisions that practitioners need to make. So here is the question, please go out and answer it. And so it tends to be a somewhat atheoretical process. And so I've worked with a lot of people that I don't know I've seen this, I saw the resume in the very beginning, the CV in the very beginning, but I don't remember, oh yeah, that person's a sociologist. I mean, it's just the people that we tend to engage with are a little bit, kind of leave behind some of the more, I don't want to say baggage, that sounds pejorative, but just that kind of like, I'm a sociologist, I'm a political scientist, this is how we view the world. Like it's a little bit, I think the people that work well with us are just much more practical and saying, yeah, what's the question? Okay. I think where we probably do get some biases are in the methods, right? So I think, there are certain methodologies that we have some bias towards. Again, not necessarily positive. We tend to just think, oh yeah, go around and interview some people. I mean, that's like our default methodology. Sampling, well, sure, why not? But not the stuff we do, but it happens, okay? So yeah, some of the challenges around that. I mean, for if we want to know the impact of a program, our first preference is still a randomized controlled trial, and that is what we. When we do trainings, and that's another thing we do is trainings on this stuff. When we say, look, if you want to know if this is working, randomized controlled trial. If you can't do a randomized controlled trial, quasi-experimental design. If you can't do a quasi-experimental design, then we do something we call rope, but it's basically like you're looking at changes over time, not just in the high-level outcomes, but along the theory of change, and also considering alternative hypotheses. I would describe it as just good basic social science. But yeah, so that's kind of the approach that we take for that particular question. But yeah, it's I guess trying to be less denominational in our approach. Yeah.
Since the World Bank is full of economists, we do have a bias towards quantitative research with causal identification strategies. When I was a sociologist, I received training in demography methods, historical case studies, qualitative research, and I am using qualitative interviews, but that's about it. And then most of my other work is a lot of econometrics and regression analysis. The work I commission also tends to be atheoretical, and it's just empirical literature that's designed to answer very important policy questions with answers that do affect, the lives of millions of people. Nigeria for Women program is aiming to reach 4.5 million women. So the questions and the answers do matter. And I am not following or particularly interested in a lot of the theoretical and ideological debates within sociology anymore either. And I think what's most important to me for the work I commissioned is that it's easily digestible. You can summarize it in 2 sentences or less, and it answers the key questions. And it addresses the limitations of the research as well.
So I also wanted to talk a little bit about uptake of research. And I think this might also, no, I think this is probably a separate question, but this is, folks in this meeting have expressed sort of, frustration with the challenges of getting policy recommendations heard or acted on. And I would have to say, probably I'll speak for all of us, we do too. We are very frustrated with trying to get our colleagues to listen or take up information. So I'm wondering if you would like to share any examples of that, of like, what are the obstacles to uptake that you've encountered without throwing anyone under the bus, of course. But and then, like what do you think people in this room should be thinking about to make uptake of their research easier?
You should start on this one. You haven't started.
I actually have an example about some research that Daniel's team put up. Commissioned academic research that I think it came out like last year. It was a 15-country case study comparison looking at democratic backsliding, democratic openings. What it was what, mostly political scientists, I think? It was all political, yes, it's a team of political scientists and their grad students, did pretty in-depth case studies of 15 countries that were sort of had backsliding trends, mainly backsliding, right? Yeah, backsliding trends, democratic backsliding. And then distilled from that, sort of the things we've been talking about this conference, like the under what conditions was backsliding more or less possible, what kinds of backsliding. And then they did a pretty good job of distilling policy recommendations that probably in dialogue with your team were actionable by USAID or the State Department. And I was having coffee a couple weeks ago with a foreign service officer, a democracy and a governance foreign service officer, very smart guy who was going off to a new post in Kyrgyzstan, and somebody I'd worked with in the past. And we had coffee and he was, worrying about Kyrgyzstan's backsliding. And I was like, he was like, what do you think, Laura? What do you think we should do? And I was like, well, there's this lit review that you could look at that the DRG Center put out. So this is someone who had worked at the DRG Center in the past. He knew that the learning team was synthesizing research, commissioning, synthesizing research, and putting it out in bite-sized 2-paragraph Friday fun fact bites, right? But in his current post, where he was in a different country, he simply, it hadn't been relevant to him at the time, and he didn't know it existed, right? So there's just this big gap. And when I was at the DRG Center, we did a survey to find out from our foreign service officers who were supposed, we were supposed to be helping make evidence-based decisions. Where do you get your information? How do you get information? And we were expecting that Google search, not even Google Scholar, but Google search was going to be the #1 answer. It was actually the #2. The #1 is I pick up a phone and call somebody I think knows about this, right? So this sort of the knowledge that gets passed on has to be relevant to the person who needs to use it at the time it comes out, or you have to constantly remind people that it's there, or there's just a sense that you constantly have to keep going back to people with this information, that there is this relevant, lit review, this research study with recommendations that you can use when you go to this new post and you're trying to help a country in backsliding. It just takes this sort of constant waiting for the right person at the right time who's ready to receive the information to be able to receive it. And I don't know, there's no way around that other than person-to-person contacts like the help desk. So it's interesting to hear that about the help desk, because that seems to be for a lot of decision makers who do not think about the information they'll need to make a decision 6 months from now, right? But it's the decision they need to make now, that they need that sort of immediate referral kind of help for the uptake to be effective. So that's just an example that I've seen, and the solution that seems to work for that example.
Just to build on that specific example, because that's an interesting case where, it was this 15-country case study, big thing. I mean, and I already said people aren't reading that. I don't know if you read. I think 2 of us in the bureau read it, but great stuff. But what they did was they took it and then they wrote a report summarizing basically the 15 case studies, right? So they have a report summarizing the 15 case studies, what you need to take away. And then there's a 3-page document that sums up the sum up of the sum up, right? I mean, that's the level that you kind of have to operate at. And in addition to multiple kind of presentations of the information in diverse kind of forums. So So yeah, that kind of that challenge, and then even with that, we've talked about, you know, that this, you know, this is still a question we get all the time. What do we do about democratic backsliding? I mean, it's like one of the main things people are, and it's like, well, we have this thing. It's like, okay, well, now we need to take it to the next level. We're developing this kind of playbook thing, and then we're going to have a training around it. And so, you know, either like a 3-day training, like that's the level of like how do you get that information from what is essentially an edited volume into something that's useful to people. It's that distillation process, as well as like, you know, presentations, as well as trainings around it. So it's pretty yeah, labor intensive to take that kind of raw input, which is what, you know, I frequently view the academic studies as. No, I don't expect my colleagues to be reviewing academic content. And this is one of the obstacles. We did a study a few years ago called the Mission Use of Evidence Study, and we looked at how people use evidence in their design decision making. So these are people that are designing USAID programs. We did a survey, we did interviews, we did coding of solicitation documents. And you know, it was really interesting. First off, people understand evidence in all kinds of different ways. I mean, that was one of the questions we started with. Like, what does evidence mean to you? Right? And there's a whole range of answers that you know that start with, well, I did this project here, and this is what we saw worked. You know, a very kind of experiential kind of evidence. To people that were really hyper-focused on like textual data from that context, those people, that place, that location, that point in time, like that's the data, they would say, evidence that they need. And other people that are thinking like the randomized control trials and, you know, the testing systematically of what works. So you get this range of thoughts around what is evidence. And people were, you know, so we ended up kind of putting it into 3 buckets for people when we talk about it. We'd say, okay, well, there's scientific research evidence, and then there's kind of contextual evidence, and there's this experiential evidence, and tell us a little bit about how you use these. And it, you know, it's interesting. I mean, we would have people that flat out would say, like, I am not interested in that research evidence over there. Like, if it's not from my context now, it's not relevant to me. I mean, this is a very common sense. People, you know, we've been talking about how important context is for so long. And I completely agree that context is super important, but there's kind of an unintended consequence of there's a lot of people that are like, no, everything is a unique snowflake, and we cannot, to borrow a phrase you might have used once, and we can't learn from anything else. And so there's, and it almost, you know, so that argument appeals to both some academic and some very serious research, but also some people that are just like, well, I don't have to pay attention to any of that other stuff anymore, because all that matters is my here and now, right? And so I don't need to know what study was done elsewhere. You know, that's not relevant. And so we spent a lot of time talking about, you know, when is evidence transferable? When can we take something from here and learn something and think about how it might apply, even if it's not the exact same context, time, and population? And so overcoming some of those challenges are significant. I would say that context people, you know, feel very, very, very strongly that if it's not there, it's not relevant. And time is the biggest one. I mean, folks in our missions are, you know, they're working 60 hours a week, and it's not necessarily all the things they want to be doing. They would love to have more time to read and to do these things. It's not that they're against it. It's just there are so many fires that they are putting out on a daily basis, and they are reacting and reactive, and that time to create space, to be thoughtful, to think forward is just really, really hard. Some people do it, but it's very challenging. The incentives are not really there for that. The incentives are respond to what the hierarchy needs and respond to the fire that is going on in the country that it's put out. And so that can distract from things. So time, a lot of what we do is trying to convince people that it doesn't have to take that much time. Like, look, talk to the evidence help desk. We'll get an academic, you spend an hour with them in a room. Like, you know, it doesn't have to be this huge time sink. You don't have time to know what all the evidence is. That's fine. Put it in the solicitation that says, we want to see not just what you're proposing, but what's the evidence behind what you're proposing, and ask for it in the solicitation. These don't have to take time for you to figure out all these things. So dealing with that time issue is a big one. And then yeah, there's kind of a third bucket that's kind of more capacity things. If people don't know where to access the information, where to find it, what to trust. There's a lot of even people that are, will say evidence is really important and we want to be evidence-based are frequently we use an expression that says a claim in search of evidence rather than an evidence-based claim, which is people have an idea and then they say, where's the evidence that supports my idea? And so and I mean, academics do this too, but this is, and people will come to us and they'll say, you're on the evidence learning team, can you give me some evidence that says this, right? And so we have to say, well, sorry, it doesn't really work that way. Here's what the evidence says on your question. So that those kinds of things, even when we are trying to encourage evidence and trying to say evidence is important, it often creates incentives to just say, okay, well, here's my citation of my one random study that supports what I say, regardless of what the larger kind of literature or knowledge or common sense has to say. So it's very challenging, even when we do make inroads on saying, yeah, evidence is important, that it's done in a meaningful way. One of the things when we did that analysis of requests for proposals, and we kind of looked at, I mean, the word evidence appears a bazillion times. It's all over. But it's not used in necessarily a way that's helpful. It's just kind of language that's kind of added in because people think evidence is important, but it doesn't lead to proposals that are evidence informed. So yeah, those are a few thoughts. Big challenges.
I've seen it all. I've seen governments completely ignore the results of very important impact evaluations, and the big ignoring them too. The Liberia Women Empowerment Project, which I manage, is based on research conducted by public health specialists from London School of Health and Tropical Medicine on the effectiveness of a social norms-based approach called SASA, which is a whole of community approach to changing social norms around gender-based violence. So in that case, the $44.6 million project is based on research conducted by public health specialists in Uganda. So I've seen it all, and I do my best to use the evidence that's out there. And we have to make bets about what's likely to work, and we have to monitor and continue to evaluate and learn, and hopefully not make the same mistakes over and over again. But in terms of like the research that I use the most, it's going to be impact evaluations, and a lot of which is published in political science and economics journals. Just as another example, there was a great piece of research done by Alex Hartman and Darren Christensen on the effectiveness of interest-based negotiation training for vulnerable communities in Liberia. And my project is piloting the scale-up of this approach for women in forest-adjacent communities, because we want women to be able to negotiate better deals for their forest tracts that they're selling off to private companies. So I use that research in a very concrete way.
Can you say a little bit about who the decision makers are that you're trying to influence, and what decision they're trying to make in those examples?
So in this case, I'm the decision maker for the forest adjacent community pilot, because I have a pot of money that's being supported by donors, and I then am hiring an NGO to implement the project based on this research. In other cases, the decision makers it's usually the World Bank and then the governor, which is the Minister of Finance in countries. And for ministers of finance, they want numbers. They want to know, okay, what is going to be the return to investment? What is the likelihood of this working? If it's a social norms-based intervention, how are we going to quantify the impacts? So it's usually a combination of World Bank directors, the board of executive directors, and the Minister of Finance.
Great. So one last question, and I don't know, actually, neither of you have a question you want to pose to the panel that we haven't asked yet? That you think people would benefit from hearing?
So yeah, at this stage, I'm really interested in new research around climate change. And I want to know like who's doing work on climate change in particularly West Africa, but I'm open to other contexts. So that's one topic. And another is collective approaches to helping communities heal from trauma.
All right, if you're working on those topics, sit with Audrey at lunch.
Yeah.
I'm sure if I thought about it a little more, I would, but nothing comes to top of mind.
So yeah, I was just trying to think like what angles haven't we covered that that folks who are in more of an academic world might not know, right? Like something that they need to know that they might not know because they're not in the jobs we're in. Or in general, like any other pathways that we haven't yet talked about that the people in this room could have more influence on decision-making in international development. Any other
I have thoughts on that.
tidbits?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot. I'd say a few routes. So one, I mentioned we manage a couple of research contracts, and so we, many U.S. government agencies are really procurement mechanisms. We the work is done by what we call our implementing partners, and that goes for research as well. So we call them our learning partners. And so there's a lot of them out there. It's quite there's this enormous range of consulting firms that do evaluation, research, assessment work on behalf of U.S. government clients, and they are always, we throw out an enormous amount of work. I mean, we have right now, we have, I would say about 70 active research projects right now that we're managing out of Washington. I mean, the missions also have their own platforms and their own mechanisms that they're doing, right? So that's at like one point in time, 70 different research studies. And the supply of researchers that can do that work isn't sufficient, frankly. I mean, we're always struggling to find good people to do this work for us. So that's certainly an avenue. We do impact evaluations like the randomized controlled trials. We do assessment work, which is a lot of in thinking about a design, go around, talk to stakeholders, understand issues a little bit better. A lot of these performance evaluations, which tend to be kind of doing surveys or doing interviews, and then a lot of kind of desk research, literature review kind of stuff, or like I mentioned, this transnational corruption study, kind of topical focuses that we look at. So, and it can be a little harder to break into if you haven't done that kind of work before for U.S. government, because we are looking for people that kind of understand the kind of realities on the ground and aren't approaching it as a purely academic exercise. But we are always looking for people. So if that's something of interest. Also, for those of you that are earlier in your careers, or considering a career change, I mean that's what I did. So it's actually a great. We hire a lot of recent PhDs, both in USAID as well as among our learning partners. We're always looking for good people there. So it's a good thing for if a graduate student of yours is not convinced about academia, this might be a really good avenue for them. I was kind of amazed when I got into the business because I had been used to kind of scrounging for change in the cushions to do research, and all of a sudden I had like $1 million budget to do survey work and great qualitative work and observational work, and I was like, oh, this is awesome at multiple points in time. So it can be really, really satisfying work. And again, the supply of researchers in our industry are insufficient for the demand of research that we have. So that's a big one. But from those just kind of looking more to kind of influence with your own work. I mean, there are people in a lot of organizations that are like me, that are bridges, basically. Like we're working with our practitioner colleagues, but we're also working with academics and engaged in academics. So finding those bridges in your field, I think, can be very helpful. Those people are definitely out there. Also the technical experts, maybe they're not researchers per se, but you're working in doing research in country X, just finding out who to reach out to and who might be interested, that those kinds of, there usually is people out there that are interested. I always tell people when we do trainings, I'm like, if there's a study that you've seen that you like, just email whoever wrote it. And I promise you, they will respond. Because I know what it's like. You want your work to be influential. You're not writing just for the sake of writing. And so if a practitioner reaches out, you will respond. And so I tell people to do that. But it also goes the other way. The reason why there isn't, I mean, our networks don't overlap very much, right? I mean, academic networks are academic networks and practitioner networks. And there's a few people like Audrey and myself that are kind of more bridges and connecting these networks, and Laura as well, of course. But so finding those bridges, I think, is really important because our networks don't otherwise overlap, and there is an audience for a lot of your work that is probably not being tapped into. So.
Just a piece of advice for those who work in developing countries, there's usually a World Bank office. And I'm sure the social development specialist based in that office would be very happy to have a coffee with anyone from this audience or any academic. Like when we're in country offices, we get lonely and we do a lot of bureaucratic work. And so having the ability to like have a intellectually interesting discussion is worth $1 million. So that's one tip. And then others, like just email people you know at the World Bank, or even me, like if you have interesting research, send it my way. I read it. And I love research. And there's also fellowship programs. So I had Adam Auerbach is a professor at SAIS, had a fellowship funded by the Council on Foreign Relations, and he worked with me for a year. And I think we both got a lot out of the fellowship program. And during that year, we did work on the impact of climate change on persons with disabilities in Uzbekistan, using very participatory methods. So something that neither of us have ever worked on, but we really enjoyed the experience. So it's that fellowship is to work within the World Bank is also a great opportunity.
So then I'll just wrap up our part of this panel with a plug. So Diana Graysboard and I are working on the social dev policy brief concept for the next however long year or and we're trying to encourage people to write policy briefs with feedback from a decision maker that they would like to influence. We'll see how this works, but in November, I think probably November 11th, I'm going to be hosting a webinar where we will start talking about this. How do you identify these people that you would like your work to reach? And how do we help these non-overlapping networks overlap a little bit better? So anyway, I would like to gauge the interest in a webinar like that. I mean, I think a lot of people turned up for this conversation. Can you just quickly raise your hand and let me know if having a webinar where we sort of dig into, in maybe even in smaller groups, like who am I trying to reach? Really just trying to identify what kind of decision maker you're trying to reach with your writing. Raise your hand if you're interested in that kind of webinar. Okay. Yeah, so that's definitely enough interest to go forward with it. Thank you. Okay, so we'll be doing that to follow up and following up on this conversation, and I will continue trying to play the bridge role in particular with this group, and help think about this writing process in particular. Okay, so now I wanted to throw it out to you for questions. I'm sure there's some questions, and please, when you ask your question, would you stand up, speak loudly, and introduce yourself to the panelists, please. Okay, first in the back there.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Nico Tama from Albany University in Indonesia. So you mentioned a little bit how sometimes the government agency you're working with ignore your recommendations. And I have that experience as well as academics, they ignore us as well. So, and you talked a little bit about this, how there can be an avenue for us as researchers, sociologists. We are particularly good at understanding problem, So is there a way for us to, for example, to come to you or any vision director in this particular country, saying like, hey, I understand this problem. I'm wondering if you can do something about it or communicate this to the government agencies in your network. Is there something that can happen, or is there any separate avenues?
Thank you so much for the question. So in Indonesia, I had the privilege of working with UGM on a large survey, and it was full of demographers and sociologists. But to answer your question, like, give me your email, I'll pass it on to my colleagues in the Indonesia country office, and then I can share their contact info with you, and I'm sure it would lead to a great conversation.
Perfect. Okay, also in the back.
Okay, my name is Saleh Ahmed. I'm from Michigan State University. I'm originally from Bangladesh. I have actually several questions I would say. The first thing is during my experience, I also actually used to work with some international agencies in different parts of the world, including Asia and Africa, where I found that there are some major issues with the quality of data and the quantity of data. If we don't actually pay attention to this, there are higher chances that we can actually create even more inequality in the society. My question to all of you would be first, how do you actually address these things? If you don't mind, I would also like to ask you two more quick questions. How do you actually pay attention to culturally sensitive responses? The reason I'm actually asking you, I think it was 2019, I was with some of my colleagues. We went to coastal Bangladesh, and I work in actually a climate adaptation field and development field. And all my colleagues were from global north, and I was the only brown skinned person, Bengali person. So most of the attention was actually on my colleagues. And we had actually a discussion, very nice discussion. After the discussion, my colleagues actually asked me, what do you think about this meeting? Like the people's responses, it looks fantastic. I said, it's all wrong. It's all wrong. I was just, since nobody actually paid attention to me, I was just walking around. I was literally trying to read their eyes, what they're saying or something like that. So last year, I actually started my own project in Zanzibar, Tanzania on blue economy. And I'm actually still struggling with, how to interpret the culturally sensitive responses. My third and small question would be often we actually have higher tendency to learn from what works somewhere else. Like big organizations like yours, do you also pay focus or attention to what didn't work some other parts of the world, something like that? And how we can actually incorporate that lessons into the future development interventions in some country context or something. Thank you.
On data, I could answer that. So usually we hire a third party to monitor survey data collection in real time. So the data from the tablets goes into a server, and then researchers monitor data collection. That's one way. And another is through careful piloting, careful selection of the right survey firms, and through getting civil society organizations involved, depending on the project as well. For the culturally appropriate, it's a really good point. And the only way to address that is by working with local partners from the actual context who can help us to interpret the data. So for the research project I worked on with Adam Arbach, we worked with persons with disabilities who then collected the data and helped and led the analysis of the data. Because it's a very sensitive topic, and we wanted to ensure that the data was collected in an ethical way and analyzed correctly.
Yeah, it's a good question. With the survey stuff, there are a lot of mitigation measures in place when it comes to survey work, right? I mean, you're doing cognitive pre-testing, so you have your questions, you're asking the questions, you're asking, what did you think about that? What was going through your mind when you answered it? You're adjusting the questions when you're doing translations, those are going through committee. And then there's all the oversight of the back checks on respondents. And so there's a lot of mechanisms in place. Do they address all the problems? Probably not, but there's a lot in place. I sometimes worry more about our qualitative work than I do about our quant, because we're just so trusting to the interviewer, as they're just going to do all that stuff. They're going to ask the questions, they're going to ask it in the right way, they're going to create that trusting environment, they're going to do all these things, and there aren't any of those measures in place. And so we certainly see this with a lot of our evaluation work, where it'll come back and the evaluation will be like, this was a wonderful project, everything was working just fabulous and great. And you're like, oh, that's interesting. What let's talk a little bit more about this. Oh, well, yes, we asked them if it was working and they told us yes. And so, right, there's this kind of, these, I mean, they don't even need to be culturally sensitive issues. I mean, there's just bias in a lot of our data when you're doing the kind of work you're doing from a donor or from a funder position, right? And so it's a challenge that I think we have. And have to take much more seriously. Unfortunately, the incentives aren't really there, right? I mean, the incentive for a respondent is to say things are going great. The incentive for the evaluator or the researcher or whatever is oh, okay, well, this is what they're telling me, and it's nice to hear things are going well. We like that. And then the reader or the on the donor side is like, but we're doing a good job, right? So everybody kind of has incentive to be for research that's very positively biased, right? And the cultural sensitivities definitely play into that and are a part of it, but it's an even bigger problem beyond that. There is a big push to have more and stronger. In the old days, yeah, there might be some renowned expert that would go and kind of lead the team. And they'd never been to the country, they didn't fully understand the context, and so they would be working with local researchers, but they were the one calling the shots. That's changed a little bit, but still not entirely. We're still, again, this issue of the supply of researchers that we need is kind of not quite up to the demand that we have. It's a huge challenge. It's something that I think we're very much aware of and deal with a lot, but mitigate, not address. Result.
And just from like an organization like PACT's perspective, and this, at least I can talk about the civil society media program I'm working on. Our purpose is more in the evaluation terminology, MEL, monitoring, evaluation, led learning. Our purpose is much more around the learning, rather than trying to have some sort of objective reality. And so what we tend to do a lot more is the decision makers we're trying to influence when we are collecting data in our programs are the civil society and media organizations that we're working with. Those are the decision people whose future decisions and behavior we're trying to influence. And so a lot of what we do is with their participation, and also the analysis has to be done alongside them for it to make sense to them. So we're not trying, I think there's these different levels of how much of objective reality are we trying to capture versus the utilization to change behavior and attitudes at the grassroots level. And so for our purposes, we compromise, compromise a lot of what would be called social science rigor for utility. And hopefully that has positive effects. And then we may or may not know to what does the program end, so we don't know whether the changes worked or not. Okay, you had the next question.
Sure, thank you. This is so helpful. I'm Tuba Garten from Providence College. So my question is on what you call the learning partners, and I really love the way you were explaining it as bridging. So I'm not going to name the organization, but I also heard from other international organizations which have these research units like yours, I think, the DRG, where they already employ people, but the sort of collecting of the evidence or impact evaluations are not necessarily centralized. So they would tell these stories about, for example, McKinsey being hired by another team directly, and sort of the consulting work is done sort of not through one channel, but through multiple channels. So that was quite interesting, again, for an academic to sort of hear that. my colleagues inside the organizations complaining. And as you were talking about sort of doing this bridge work, so I'm curious, when you are working with large consulting firms versus smaller ones that are sort of established by, you know, people, and then the Global Poverty Center, right? Like sort of the initiative. So I'm wondering about what kind of institutional institutions we can think about. And I'm hoping they're going to be different and not completely be this large consulting model that came from accounting, right, to development world. And I'm sure there's a place for it, but also we need other types of, I think, bridges. So I'm really curious about what you think about these types of other ways of you know, building the bridges.
Yeah. I mean, just, you know, USAID actually did something that's kind of interesting, that where US government agencies are required to do a certain amount of contracting with small businesses, right? And, you know, it's in legislation. So they realized early on that MEL was monitoring, evaluation, research work, and assessment work, you know, was something that couldn't be done by small businesses. And so most of our work that occurs in this space are done by small businesses. There are a few large businesses that are there and that do hold some big contracts, but there are also a ton of small ones. And then they I mean, there's like I can name 30 off the top of my head. I mean, it's a big field, and and then, yeah, there's a lot of diversity. I mean, they are frequently subcontracting with other partners, right? So a lot of our partners, so we have two, the Collaborators Group and Social Impact are the two that we currently have under contract. And they have a network of other groups that they're working with, several of which are academics. You mentioned UPenn at once, they're a partner. We've had different academic partners at different times that are working with and feeding into. And then a lot of academics that they're contracting with as a consulting. It's much easier. It's very hard to partner with universities. Their universities will set up these offshoots that have financial independence, but to contract with the university is a nightmare. So there's a lot of kind of consulting agreements with individual faculty is kind of how we work. And then, yeah, in country, you know, there's a lot of in-country partners, and then always the data collection firm, if we're doing quant work, is a locally hired data collection firm that's actually doing the survey enumeration. Occasionally, they'll use data collection partners for qualitative work, but those tend to be like, you know, broad scale focus group discussions, you know, pretty large operations, not the kind of more focused and flexible semi-structured kind of. I'm not sure if that answered your question, but yeah.
I hire primarily individual consultants, so academics. And I've also had a number of experiences trying to contract universities, which is the contracting process, because of legal agreements, takes more than 3 months, which is cost prohibitive for us.
Hi, I'm Rachel Robinson from American University here in DC from the School of International Service. And I wanted to put in a plug for a project or a program that you might be interested in that is called Bridging the Gap. It used to be run out of SIS, it's now run out of Denver, University of Denver, but it is specifically designed for training academics to implement policymakers. And it comes out of a political science space, so it is a lot more towards like getting an op-ed or something into foreign affairs. But definitely check it out, because sociologists have done it, and they have a workshop every summer in DC where they bring people here for training. So it's bridgingthegapproject.org. And then my question for you is about what in your research findings point towards the aid delivery mechanisms and processes themselves as opposed to sort of the subject matter. So I'm thinking of my own research, which shows it would be really helpful if USAID didn't always put their logo on stuff. And if that, yeah, so is that an uphill battle, or are there graceful, you know, are there ways to do that?
I can start. Nice to see you, Rachel. Another thing that we do is we have a talk series that we do where we invite academics, and Rachel presented, this was early last year, right?
Oh, I think it's been long. Yeah.
So nice to see you. Yeah, I mean, the logo issue comes from higher levels, and yes, you know, there is some evidence behind it, actually. Their Matt Winners at Illinois did some research looking at kind of what branding does, and you know, it's nice for things like health clinics, if you know, and it makes people think the US are good, and it also adds some kind of external credibility, which could be nice in some certain context. I know for research stuff, it's a huge headache for us. I mean, I just deal with this all the time because every research project we have is a USAID document. And then there's a little line that says it does not represent the US government, right? But it says USAID on it. And we produce a lot of critical stuff. I mean, that's our job. We're supposed to be criticizing and trying to make our work better. And then it just leads to these constant fights with our missions where they're like, well, I don't really want this to be public. And fortunately, we have a very strong policy when it comes to evaluation, where our evaluations, you know, really have to be public. There are some loopholes in there, but and there are some country waivers, right? So like if we do work in really high sensitive countries, the country as a whole can get a waiver to say that, yeah, nothing in this country needs to be identified as such, and individual projects can get waivers for certain things. So those are out there. There's also co-branding sometimes where USAID appears as one of many partners that are out there. But the default is USAID all over everything. So there are exceptions. It can be done, but it has to be done kind of ahead of time and not after the fact. You know.
Hi, thanks for this. This is great. My name is Pat Corder-Peter. I'm a PhD student at Boston College. I have a question about timelines. It seems like there's a sort of divergence in some of the timelines. You know, some of the interventions born from theory and research on how development happens, how it can happen better, doesn't necessarily conform to the budget cycle or the 2 to 5 year program cycle. So I'm wondering sort of how we can reconcile the timeline tension to ensure that we aren't searching for evidence to support a claim or to justify a certain approach, but we aren't just lining up discrete 5 year programs one after the other, but sort of making progress on these larger goals that require sort of long running sustained.
I try to do evaluations in the really short term, so 2 years. And then online evaluations at 5 years, and then long term, 10 years. So we did that in Indonesia, and we're also doing that in Nigeria. And effects do differ over time.
Yeah, we did have a mechanism to do long-term impact evaluations. There's not as much interest in that kind of stuff because even like ex post, like, you know, after the program is closed out, like what's still around, what's sustainable. There's just isn't a use case for a lot of it, right? So you produce it, you find out interesting things, people learn a lot, but all the planning has to occur, you know, years in advance for what the next follow-on is, right? So if we want to inform, if we have a 5 year program running and we want to inform the follow-on, then we need to have the data that we need, the evidence that we need 1 year before the previous year program closes out, right? So that really ties our hands a long way. So even if you know, there's a lot of people that would like to do that more long-term thinking, but when we've done it, people are like, oh, interesting, and then we move on. You know, the decisions have already made. Decision making and timelines is one of the biggest challenges that we have, I'd say. And we've done studies on utilization of our products, and it is consistently the biggest challenge that we have is that people are like, hey, I need information. And we're like, okay, great, we can get it to you in 6 months to a year. And they're like, oh no, I needed it tomorrow. Can you get it to me? So that is super challenging for us. Yeah.
And then I think there's also an issue when it requires human subjects of extractive, right? And you know, 5 years ago, you were part of this project. Please take an hour of your time to tell us how you're doing. That's another problem. But I mean, just the short time horizon for planning is, you know, in terms of development outcomes is the bigger problem. Yeah.
In the World Bank, though, we have models. And that 10-year evaluation is really important to inform that model for other contexts. So that's why I think it's incredibly important to know whether the effects are sustainable.
All right, we're gonna, all
Millennium Challenge Corporation works like that. Yeah.
right, our last question goes to you.
I had hear more about this afternoon. We're doing research on social equity and climate change. I kind of a big picture question. Maybe 40 years ago, let's say 30 years ago, someone said to me that USAID is great at encouraging innovation. And that changed. And the World Bank is great at taking, success stories and scaling them. And those are two very different kind of modes. If you're trying to encourage something more than just incremental steps, but potentially transformative change like SASA is trying to do. SASA worked for many, many years in Uganda to figure it out. They're trying to encourage norms that support more harmonious relationships in the household among the husband and wife. And they originally were focusing on violence, but that just was exacerbating the violence, was making it salient. So they redirected it and everything. And it still took time to build the model. And maybe that's what sociologists can help with, to innovate and help with more than mental steps to greater well-being for everybody. And I just wanted to make that point. Point I want to make is that I've been gathering qualitative research my whole career, and I'm on that and being part of my career. And there's issues, so much corruption at the local level. And I'm still getting reports, from communities that those who need it most may never get it. And in, my most recent data, they're saying it's the same to everybody. Dr. Keller said, yes, we know that means testing raises alternative problems. I think some of the problem is on the donors that are financing all this corruption. And I don't know that RCTs help. I don't, but I do think programs that help build learning and capacity for getting information, inclusion, these are the empowerment source book triggers, access to information, participation, accountability, and then a capacity building to support all of that. We've known that for a long time, but still so much.
On the corruption question, like you're absolutely right. But there are different models that work better or worse to minimize corruption risks. So I'm in the part of the World Bank where we use community-driven development approaches that provides block grants to communities. Communities get to decide how to allocate the funds, and the program pays for facilitation to make sure that their decisions are fully participatory, they have the right training, and communities play an active role in monitoring implementation. So in Indonesia, we had PNPM enduring for a long time. Corruption doesn't completely disappear, but we know, at least from the Indonesia context and many others, that corruption risks are lower when you compare it to other alternatives. And we know that through a lot of rigorous research, qualitative, quantitative, and also relying on communities themselves to report it.
Great. So let's go break for lunch, but continue the conversation. Give us some time to go get some lunch. And then, look for us at a table here if you want to continue the conversation. Thanks everyone for joining.